In any case, since we have so many things to discuss and a very limited amount of time, I thought we might begin with an inverted question that will help us cover more ground. Besides that cartoonish hat with the horns, what do we usually get most wrong when we talk about the Vikings?
Actually, the cartoonish hat with the horns might not be as wrong as we think.
No way.
Yeah, so maybe
So even that thing I got wrong. That's
well,
unbelievable.
that's not on you. That's scholars that for about a century now have been pointing out that the hat is wrong. But we do have so Vikings probably didn't wear helmets with horns in war. We have no evidence of that. But we do have these little sort of pins that seem to have been maybe they were supposed to be attached on your clothes or placed somewhere in a temple or something like that. They have these little male heads, and from the head there are these horns that go out and become raven heads on top of them. These pins are usually associated with Odin because actually several of them have, so they were like cast with two eyes, but then they scratched out one eye, which, seems to be Odin.
Okay, because he only had one eye, right?
Yeah, and
Okay.
so we can maybe theorize that the ravens coming out of his head as horns, that would be Hugin and Munin. So it's not entirely wrong when people assume that some Vikings might have had horns in their helmet, so to speak. But to go back to your question, well, I think the biggest mistake that we make when we talk about Vikings in a popular context is this tendency to associate, first of all, Vikings with specific ethnicities, the Scandinavian ones, and also associate Vikings or the peoples who lived in the Viking Age with, ultra-violence. Those are the main problems in our understanding of what the Viking Age was. So a Viking as a person in the Viking Age is a trader, a raider, a warrior, and also a soldier, and also has the potential to become a chieftain or a king or something like that. It's a very specific pursuit, so to speak, in life. And the estimate is that it was only about 10% of the population in Scandinavia who were engaged with these activities that we associate with Vikings. So the rest, they were farmers and just normal, everyday people, not particularly invested in invading England or anything like that.
Okay. Definitely you shattered some of the stereotypes that I had. I thought, it was one big raiding party, without the horns, but still.
Just all these Scandinavians is constantly on boats everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's another thing that's really important to also keep in mind. What we see in the Viking Age in Scandinavia, and what we can see from the genetic makeup of the skeletons that we can identify as, for instance, warriors from the time, they come from a lot of different places. They're not just from Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. They are also from Poland and from Germany and from Spain and so on. It is in fact in the Viking Age that Scandinavians start, in genetic sense, to mix more with the rest of Europe. So again, the image of the blonde Viking should be shattered too, because the Viking might have had darker hair, brown, even black hair. So that's also important to keep in mind.
But there was like a culture that united them.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the concept of Viking was very present. You see this in the carved runestones where, they commemorate dead warriors. They talk about this person was a Viking and this person went a Viking. So you could both be a Viking and you could go a Viking, so to speak. And of course, the two things combine. If you're going a Viking, which I guess would be sort of the term that collects both ideas of like raiding distant shores and also peaceful trade and interaction of various kinds, right? Um, you could go and do that, and then of course, if you went and did that, then you would also be considered a Viking, right?
How is the so-called Viking society organized and structured? Who was at the top? Who was at the bottom, roughly speaking?
So honestly, we don't know much about that. We know something. We can see from archaeological records that there is, of course, a stratified society. There are very wealthy people and there are very poor people. There are people who seem to have a lot of freedom without necessarily being at the highest top of society. And then there are, of course, people who don't have any freedom at all and are slaves. Um, and then we, of course, have all the saga literature and the material that has been written after the Viking Age describing society in the Viking Age. And we can only trust that to an extent, obviously, because the sagas, they're written down at the earliest, like 200 years after the Viking Age. So it's essentially Icelanders primarily writing about their ancestors. And they tell us about a steep hierarchy, very stratified society where you have kings at the top, and then you have what would compare to knights, and then you have different kinds of peasants and different levels of peasants. After that, free peasants and tenant peasants and such. Now, whether or not that is entirely the case throughout the Viking Age, and if that is also applicable to all of Scandinavia, that's a good question. Because if we look at the archaeological material, southern Scandinavia seems to have steeper hierarchies than the northern parts of Scandinavia. That has something to do with population density and of course also choices in terms of like what type of society are we creating. So you could expect, for instance, Denmark to probably have what is more or less a fully fledged quote unquote European style kingdom already from the 700s.
Also, like a feudalist society.
More or less, I don't want to call it feudalist as such at that point, because feudalism is sort of developing in Scandinavia in this time period. We can see aspects of feudalism, but obviously it's probably like structured a little differently than what, for instance, is the case in the Frankish Empire. We see, for instance, hunting parks being established in the 700s in Scandinavia. So this means that there is an elite that monopolizes hunting for their pleasure alone. And that
sounds very royal already.
Exactly. That's a very feudal phenomenon, right? But on the other hand, it also looks, when we look at the way that the farms are placed and the land that each farm has available and so on, that is very different depending on whether or not we're in southern Scandinavia or in central or northern Scandinavia. And it looks like in central and northern Scandinavia, like most of Norway, for instance, and most of Sweden, people were freer than in the southern parts. Like, again, I say with free with quotation marks here, because we don't actually know what free actually translates to in a Viking Age setting. And adding to this, we have, of course, the poem called Vrix Thula, the wandering or the song of Rig. Usually it's translated to Rig's wandering, like wandering around, because that's what he does. And Rig is possibly a god of some kind. It might be Heimdallr or Odin. That really depends on the scholar that you talk to. And this poem sets up a class structure with slaves and then free peasants and then elite, and tells us basically that Rig is responsible for creating those classes in society. Now, the problem with the poem, a lot of scholars use that poem to sort of understand class structures in the Viking Age. But the problem with this poem is that it's composed in the 1300s. It could very well describe more of a situation in the 12 and 1300s than something in the Viking Age. But what stands to reason is, of course, that we do have societies with elite classes that are very wealthy compared to other parts of society. And those elite classes have some power to decide what happens to the rest of the population. That's for sure.